231. All right, here we're going to begin the second unit of 231, which begins with bones, and it starts with a chapter on the structure of bones, both how bones work, how they get put together, and so forth. This is my old dog Elvis. We lost Elvis a few years ago, and my wife, who's still healthy. Okay, Miss Frizzle gets out the skeleton. It's time for the bones. We may give one or more of the lectures in this section in the lab, so that you guys, as I'm giving the lecture, you can have the bones in your hands. Otherwise, we may go over and get some boxes of bones and bring them over here, so we can do it that way. The labs are very crowded right now. I have 10 minutes between before and after both of my labs. We usually have a half hour in there, but anyway. So when we talk about the skeletal system, we're talking about the bones, the cartilages, and the ligaments, the things that hold them together and make them work and do things. Just leave it at that. What are the functions of the skeletal system? I think we have mentioned this back in the tissues chapter, but basically you need to know this list. Our bones support us, hold us up, and they store minerals for us. The main mineral that they store is calcium. They also store a lot of phosphate, but we will spend a lot of time in anatomy and physiology, throughout anatomy and physiology, talking about calcium metabolism. Calcium is a very important chemical in our bodies. You only have to watch the ads on TV to see all the ads about little old ladies getting osteoporosis and breaking bones and all these medicines that Big Pharma is trying to sell them in order to make their bones stronger. But just know that the calcium is very important, and we will talk about that. Not only here in the bone chapter, but we'll talk about it when we get to kidneys. We'll talk about it when we get to the heart, and so forth. So there's lots of places where calcium makes our body work. You know that the bone marrow, on the middle parts of the bone, are where blood cells are made. Not only our red blood cells are made there, but also a lot of the other white cells are made there as well. Our bones protect us. Think about the skull protecting your brain. Think about your rib cage protecting your heart and lungs. And your spinal column protecting your spinal cord. We really need all that bony protection that we can get, especially for the vital parts of our body like that. And then leverage, the bones provide leverage that makes us be able to move. And it's a multiplication thing. Just as an example, this muscle here, the bicep muscle, starts about there and it ends right there on the radius right there. And if you tighten it up, you can all do this. You can actually feel the tendon of your biceps right there, right? You can feel that hard tendon at the end of your biceps right there. And notice that it's not going into this bone here, it's going into this bone here across the joint. So that when this muscle shortens, and let me just show you, when it shortens, it goes from here to there. How much do you think that muscle actually shortened? It probably shortened maybe 2 or 3 inches at the most. You know, it's this long now, and when you shorten it, it's still about the same length. It just shortens a little bit, but look how much my hand moved. You know, even though the muscle only moved 2 or 3 inches, my hand moved 1.5 feet. Okay, that's what we're talking about here when we talk about leverage. Bones are classified by shape, internal tissue organization, and bone markings. I think this is really, I think classifying bones by shape is really silly. You'll see what I mean when I show you the shapes they split them up into. We will talk about the difference in how some of them are organized differently inside, and we will spend a lot of time talking about the surface features of the bones. You know, by the end of this next 2 weeks, you should be able to identify all the bones. You'll know whether it's the right or left one. You'll know, you should be able to figure them all out because they all have very interesting characteristics, mostly surface markings that we'll talk about. So here's what they call the different bones by shape. I think this is pretty silly. I think maybe a couple of them are helpful. One is called the long bones. Most of the big bones in our body are long bones, and they're all set up and organized about the same way. So that's a reasonable one. I think the flat bones, like the skull mainly, are different enough from the others that you ought to know about them. I think these are silly. Sutural bones, irregular bones. What's irregular? Hell, there's not any of them that are regular. They're all irregular. Which of them are short? I don't know. It just depends on where you want to cut it off. You know, the finger bones, you can call these short, but they don't. Those are long because they're obviously a lot longer than they are wide. And then the other one you probably ought to know is a type of bone called the sesamoid bone. And we humans only have one of them. It's called the patella. And what a sesamoid bone means is that it is a bone that is entirely encased in a tendon. Okay? So this is the only one we have. And the muscle here, your quadriceps muscle, which has 4 muscles that kind of come together. The tendon of the quadriceps comes across your knee and implants right down here into the top of your tibia, and it makes your foot do this, go up, go forward. So it helps you walking. You need it every step. But in the process of that sesamoid bone, that tendon coming around here, it has formed the patella within the tendon itself. Sort of helps it make that corner. One time I ran over a raccoon driving home out when I lived out in the Dalles, and being the science teacher that I was, I stopped and picked him up and threw him in the car and decided I would make a project for the kids to build his skeleton back, wire it all together and make a raccoon skeleton. And in order to do that, I staked him out in the backyard and put a couple of pieces of chicken wire over him so that the other animals wouldn't come and eat him. And just let him lay out there in the sun. And sure enough, about 4 months later, everything was pretty gone, much gone except for the bones and the skin. So I went out there and kind of swept the skin away, and here's this big pile of bones. Damn, coons have about 50 sesamoid bones. Almost every one of their tendons has a bone in it. And so you end up with all these extra bones, and it's like, wow, this is going to be hard for these kids to figure out. And I sort of ended up abandoning that project. But yeah, sesamoid bones, only one in humans, but there's a lot in a number of animals. Bone markings, I'm going to throw a bunch of words at you here for a few minutes. They're not very specific. Depressions or grooves, that's a kind of marking, and we're going to learn a whole lot of grooves and a lot of depressions and little valleys that appear on the surface of the bones. Projections are little bulges that come out. Like on the head of the femur, there's a head, and it fits into a socket and moves around like this, So this is a projection here. This is a depression on that side, but that, we're splitting things here a little bit. Tunnels, you'll see that a lot of the bones have holes in them. That's where the arteries go in, the blood vessels come out, where the nerves go in, things like that. And then there's this really shocking list that you see. Please ignore this list for at least a week. Because these words will all make great sense to you by the end of the week. Because once we point out specific things on specific bones, all these words will make sense. Example, the neck. A condyle is is like the end of the tibia where it's nice and round and smooth, where the bones articulate on each other. Foramens are holes, sulcuses are grooves, fossa is a depression, and so forth. So I'm not going to tell you to ignore this, but I will tell you that I think if you just pay attention to the lecture and we go through the bones one by one, these words will all make sense to you. And you won't really have to spend a lot of time just memorizing a list like that. This is an exam. This is kind of an introduction here. Here's the femur right here. The femur is the largest bone in your body. It's your thigh bone. It's the hardest one to break. And it has up on the top end here, it has a head, it has a neck, and it has some trochanters. Trochanters are bulges. Usually trochanters are where big muscles insert onto the bone. So there's these big hip muscles up here, go around and back and so forth, that make your hip move. They're obviously big muscles, some of the biggest muscles in your body, and they insert here on these trochanters. And actually, the trochanters are there due to 100 million years of pressure pulling on it, and it getting stronger in that particular area, and therefore it kind of bulges out. That's really the basis of a lot of these shapes. So these tubercles down here also have bones attached to them on either side of the distal end of the femur. Here's a condyle. Condyle is a smooth articular surface. A facet is where bones rotate on other bones. Here's the skull. You guys we will go over the skull. You'll learn all the bones in the skull, all the holes in the skull, all of the things that it does that are so wonderful for you. Anyway, so there's a fissure back here in the back of your eye, which is a hole where the nerves from the eye can go out. You have a foramen right here, where a little artery goes in to supply your frontal sinus and so forth. Bones have holes in them. They have hollow areas in them called sinuses. There's an example right there. Here's a little canal back in here where the lacrimal duct, which is your tear duct flow, goes through, and so forth. Your mandible down here, and we'll go through the skull very completely here in a day or two. This is the arm bone called the humerus. It has a head to it also. Your shoulder is actually the most movable joint in your whole body. If you think about it, you can move it through a huge range of motion. Because of that, because of the fact that it's so mobile, it's also one of the weakest joints in our body. As a result, it gets dislocated pretty frequently. I'll just leave it at that for now. So there's a head and there's a sulcus. This is where there's a tendon that runs right down here over the top of your shoulder that, when you do your lateral flies. I need the weightlifters to step forward and help me out on some of these. I'm not very good at it. But here's a tuberosity where muscles attach. A trochlea is a joint, a groove where things rotate through. Fossa on the back there. Here's the pelvic bone. Actually, half of the pelvic bone, as you can see. There's crests. There's fossas. Once again, fossa, big, smooth, hollowed out area. There are little spines on it that are very significant. This little spine right there, called the ischial spine, is the one that most frequently determines whether you can have a baby vaginally or not. If your pelvis is really narrow and your ischial spines are too close together, it just may be closer than your baby's head will fit through. Usually, given enough time, the kid's head will get deformed enough to fit through there, but it certainly has led to millions of women dying through the years before the days of C-sections. My personal feelings have to always come out, and my kids were born by C-section. And although, the public thinks, there's too many C-sections done in this world, it's a pretty small price to pay when you consider the alternative, which was, as much as a 30 to 40% maternal mortality rate, childbirth. How many guys would sign up to have your wife get pregnant if they knew there was a 30% chance she would die having the baby? I mean, that's a pretty big deal. And kind of gotten off the subject here a little bit, but I got to preach to you a little bit here. I was in Boston, Massachusetts one time and went through one of the old church cemeteries there, and from the 1800s and so forth. And you would go past grave after grave after grave that would say things like, John Jones is buried here along with 2 of his wives who died in childbirth and his 3rd wife, Mary, and 17 children who all died before the age of 5. Just go there sometime and read all the headstones. It will blow you away at how far we've progressed in medicine and surgery since those days. Because life was tough. You can't imagine losing a couple of kids or a couple of wives from childbirth. If you were the guy, wouldn't you sort of feel responsible? Just thought. Okay, let's talk about the structure of bones. This is one of the ways we structure the long bones. These are the long bones, and a long bone is broken into 3 parts. It's broken into the diaphysis, which is the shaft in the middle. That's all one big piece. That's where the bone marrow lives mostly. It's very strong, heavy wall of compact bone, and it has a central space called the marrow. Then it has the epiphysis, and the epiphysis is the 2 pieces on either end. And in most long bones, the epiphysis is wider and bigger than the central part. It's the part that articulates with the other bone. It's mostly spongy bone. We'll talk about what spongy bone means in a few minutes. That makes up that epiphysis, and it's covered with some compact bone over the top. It's also covered over the top with cartilage on the parts that rub up next to other bones. Hyaline cartilage, remember that? The metaphysis is the place where the diaphysis and the epiphysis meet. And so every bone has 2 metaphyses as well. And if I had a marking pen here, which I probably don't, here's one right here. I got the drops. So if this is a long bone, this is the shaft in the middle, and it's mostly hollow with bone marrow in it. And then here on this end is one epiphysis, and on the other end is the other epiphysis. And then in between here is this area which is called the metaphysis. And so here's the other metaphysis. Now, just so you know, when babies are born, we'll go into this more in depth, but when babies are born, they're mostly all cartilage. They have very little bone to them. And that's why when a baby or a small child breaks a bone, you got to think about that, because kids just don't break bones. Little bitty kids certainly don't break bones unless somebody takes them and does this, or does something really awful to break the bone. So you should always have a high suspicion of child abuse whenever you see a kid with a broken bone. It's usually not from falling off the bed, like the parents will always say. I should say, as the boyfriend will always say. And then later in life, as you get older and older, these things actually fuse, and then it becomes one long bone. But that doesn't really fuse until you're like up in your teenage years, when the epiphyses actually fuse. The metaphysis really goes away, and this becomes all one bone from end to end. Okay, we'll talk about that. So here's an example right here of this long bone. This is the femur once again. Epiphysis at this end, epiphysis at that end. metaphysis is where they join here and here, and then the shaft in the middle of the diaphysis. Bones of the skull are different than all the rest because they are called spongy bone. They're made of spongy bone. We have spongy bone other places, but they're basically a sandwich of spongy bone between two layers of compact bone. And within the skull, that layer of spongy bone in between the compact bone is called the diplo. Diplo. Two layers, spongy in the middle, diplo. It looks like this. You have compact bone on the outside, right here and right here, and then this spongy bone, this diplo in between. So there's really marrow kind of all in there as well in the skull bones. Bone is a dense supportive tissue, as you know. It contains some specialized cells. The matrix, and we've talked about the matrix a few times. What is the matrix? What does that word mean to you? When I say matrix.
A space where things come together.
It's what?
A space where things come together.
A place things are, nah, what's the matrix of cartilage? It's what?
It's the things in around the cartilage.
It's around the cartilage cells. It's all the kind of clear area that's solid. Okay? In bone, that area is going to be hard, and it's going to be calcium mainly, calcium salts. What was the matrix in loose areolar tissue? It was the ground substance, another name for it. It was just that clear liquid that the fibers and the cells kind of hung out in. Okay? And what's the matrix of blood? Huh? Just the plasma, the fluid, the serum, yes. Okay? So when we use the word matrix, I just want you to be sure you understand what that word means. Well, we'll talk about the matrix of bone as we go through this. So the thing to remember is in bone, the matrix is very solid. It's solid calcium salts. There's lots of collagen fibers that run through those calcium salts. And because of that, because we have a lot of collagen fibers in there, our bones don't just shatter like a windshield. Okay? If our bones didn't have collagen protein fibers running through it, and you cracked your bone, it would just shatter. Might break into 100 pieces. Okay? But it doesn't do that because of the fact that there's lots of protein running through it that makes it a lot stronger. And indeed, even in adults, our bones can give a little bit. They can bend a little bit before they break because of the fibers running through them. So what are the characteristics of bone tissue? Well, as I said, first of all, there's this dense matrix, which contains these deposits of calcium salts. The cells that are found within compact bone are called osteocytes. And what were the cells found that were found in cartilage? Chondrocytes. Right. The other thing is that osteocytes, just like chondrocytes, live in lacunae. Lacunae is just a fancy name for a hole in the bone. Just like in cartilage, the lacunae were a hole in the cartilage where the chondrocytes lived in. In these guys, it's a hole in the bone. Now, the lacunae are neatly organized in bone tissue. And we also have these other structures, these little canals called canaliculi. And canaliculi are the way that blood and oxygen, the oxygen from the blood that runs through these central vessels. I'm going to draw a picture of an osteon. I'll expand on this in subsequent slides here. But if we start, well, an osteon has a thing called a central canal in the middle of it. And in the central canal, there are arteries and veins, okay? Arteries and veins. Okay, then around that, there's a layer of these lacunae that have osteocytes in them. And there are actually layers of them that go around this osteon like this. And they keep getting bigger and bigger. They don't get all that big, I'll tell you. Between these osteocytes, there's these little connections called canaliculi. The canaliculi are nothing more than extensions of their cytoplasm. Okay? So the cell membrane, the edge of the cytoplasm, kind of extends out and reaches over and tries to touch the next cell in the next layer, because the oxygen that's needed by this cell out here, the only way it can get there is to diffuse. It can't diffuse through the bone. It's solid salt, right? So it has to diffuse through these little canaliculi to get out to this cell and then work its way through that cytoplasm to get out to the next cell and then out to the next cell and so forth. Okay, I'll have better pictures in a minute. So the canaliculi form pathways, not really for blood vessels, just for diffusion of things. The periosteum, remember we talked about the perichondrium, which is the layer that surrounds cartilage. The periosteum covers all the outside surfaces of bones. And it consists of two layers, the outer fibrous layer and the intercellular layer. We'll get to them in a minute. But if you go to Kentucky Fried Chicken and eat a piece of chicken, and at the end you eat your chicken bone, your leg bone, and you break it, and then you kind of pull it apart, that little stringy stuff that will still connect and tries to hold those two pieces together, that's the periosteum. Okay. Now you got to remember, it's a lot tougher than that because it's been cooked under pressure at 440 degrees for 12 minutes or something like that. Frying does tend to change things. Okay, how about the contents of these matrix minerals that are out there? Well, 2/3 of the bone matrix is calcium phosphate. I think you probably ought to know that. 2/3 of bone matrix is calcium phosphate. Now, the way you get that is that it reacts with calcium hydroxide. It forms crystals of hydroxyapatite. You don't have to know these structure numbers and all this stuff. But this stuff is what incorporates all of these calcium salts and ions together to form the matrix minerals, okay, that are the solid parts of bone. Now, running through that matrix minerals, through the salt, are these matrix proteins that I just mentioned a minute ago. They're mostly collagen, and so indeed about 1/3 of the matrix of bone is not salt. About 1/3 of it is actually collagen fibers. Makes it strong, also makes it a little bit flexible. There's 4 different types of cells in the bone that you need to know. I'll just tell you. They make up only about 2% of the overall amount of bone. In other words, here's bone. Bone is 98% matrix, which means collagen fibers, about 1/3 of it. 2/3 of it is the chemicals, the salts that we just talked about. And there's 4 kinds of cells, and they're really easy, but you got to know them, okay? And let's just go through them one by one here. There's osteoprogenitor cells. Now, just from looking at the name, what do you think they are? They're what? They're generator cells, yeah. They're the stem cells that can turn into bone cells, okay? So osteoprogenitor cells are kind of the precursors of all the rest of these. The next one is called an osteoblast. So after a cell decides it's going to be a bone cell when it grows up, it turns into an osteoblast. What does an osteoblast do? Makes bone. Remember what a chondroblast did? It made cartilage. Once it's created bone all the way around it, it's now called a osteocyte. And its job is no longer to make bone, its job is to take care of the bone. and that cell has a nucleus to it, and it can decide how much, whether there's enough salt, whether the pH is right, whether there's enough glucose to keep this bone healthy and alive. Because even though it's mostly salt, it's still pretty much alive, right? Because there's lots of protein in it. And then the last one, the fourth kind, is kind of the oddball because it's different. It didn't come from these guys. It's a separate thing. It's called an osteoclast. Any ideas on what it does?
Breaks bone down.
It eats up bone. That's right. So when you break your bone, for example, and you put the bones kind of back together, you need osteoclasts to go in and eat up the bone that's not going to fit anymore, and you're going to put osteoblasts in there to add new bone to make it grow back. But osteoclasts are very important because they are what we use if our calcium got too low. So if the calcium in our bloodstream got too low, our body would say, hey, osteoclasts, go eat up some bone and release that calcium out into the bloodstream to raise our calcium level. Okay? So osteoclasts play a very important role in maintaining our calcium levels in our blood. Yes?
Is that what happens with osteoporosis?
Yes, the osteoclasts are overactive. And the osteoblasts are not active enough. Okay, so they're not laying down enough new bone, and the osteoclasts are eating up the bone. It's a constant battle in our bones between osteoclasts that want to make the bone weaker, put more calcium out into our system, raise our calcium levels, and our osteoblasts, which want to take the calcium out of the bloodstream, build new bone, and lay it down as new bone. Make sense? Okay. All right, so now we're going to go through those four again, like we always do with this slide set. Just trust me, I've thrown 2/3 of the slides away. For every lecture, I've thrown 2/3 of them away. What? Yes. They're very repetitive, and some of them I just don't think are all that important. Anyway, so the osteoprogenitor cells are the mesenchymal cells. Mesenchyme means embryonic kind of stuff. That's right. Mesenchymal, especially mesenchymal stem cells, are cells that can become several different things. Okay? But mesenchymal stem cells that are osteoprogenitor cells are ones that are destined to become osteoblasts. They're going to become bone cells. They're going to become osteoblasts, make bone around them, and then as they mature, they become osteocytes and live there in the bone for quite a while. Osteoprogenitor cells are found in the endosteum. Okay, endosteum. Now, I told you earlier that bone has a layer on the outside in the chicken bones, remember, on the outside out here, which is called periosteum, okay? On the outside, really tough, really strong. On the inside, right here, on the inside of the compact bone, between the bone and the marrow, we have endosteum. Okay? Now, it's not very tough, but it has a lot of cells in it, and that's where these mesenchymal cells live, and that's where most of your new bone is laid down, on the inside. Okay, so these osteoprogenitor cells, we're going to show you slides in a minute, are located in the endosteum, and they assist in fracture repair. So you break a bone, you better hope these guys come to life to start laying down new bone, to make bone to repair it. Osteoblasts are immature bone cells that secrete matrix. In other words, they lay down the bone, they lay down the salt. And that laying down of bone itself is called osteogenesis. the name of the first book of the Bible? And what's it about?
The beginning.
In the beginning, that's right. It's like the creation of the earth, according to that story, right?
You just asked me.
Yeah, I figured you knew. And you did. Way to go. I figured you've never missed a day of church in your life. I'm just go easy
I
on me.
think that's right.
Huh?
You got that right.
I got that right?
Yes.
There you go. Pope told me that. All right. Anyway, so you got these osteoblasts, and they start making this bone around them, and we call that osteogenesis. The stuff that they lay down is called osteoid. Now, osteoid is kind of soft bone. It hasn't yet become totally calcified, so it hasn't gotten hard yet. And that's why we call it osteoid. Okay? Once the osteoblast has laid down bone all the way around itself, now it's living in a lacunae, which is the hole in the bone, and we now call them osteocytes. Once they're osteocytes, they don't go anywhere, they don't do anything other than just look after that little bit of bone that's all the way around them. And try to take care of it and maintain it. Osteocytes are the mature bone cells that maintain the bone matrix. They live in the lacunae. They're between the layers of the matrix. And they're connected by cytoplasmic extensions through these canaliculi. They don't divide, and really all they do is sit there and maintain the protein, mineral, chemical content of the matrix. The only other time they do anything is if the bone is damaged. Then they spring back to life and start working to repair the bone. Okay? Osteoclast, I mentioned already, they are the ones that are they're great big cells. They are multinucleate. They have a bunch of nuclei, sometimes as many as 30 or 35 nuclei, and these are the eater-upper guys. They dissolve bone matrix, and they release that stored mineral. Those stored minerals mainly calcium. So if your calcium level drops low, your body is going to activate its osteoclasts to have them start eating up the bone and releasing more calcium to bring your calcium level up. Because we need calcium for our heart to beat, we need calcium for our muscles to contract, we need calcium for lots of the basic functions of life, including a signal arriving from one nerve cell and making the jump over to the next nerve cell. We use calcium in all of those different processes. So calcium is very important. These are not derived from the bone line, from the bone cell line. They're actually derived from stem cells that produce macrophages. Remember macrophages? Macrophages eat up stuff, right? They're the garbage men of our body. And so these osteoclasts, even though the name sort of looks like they're bone cells, they didn't derive from the bone cells. They didn't derive from those osteoprogenitor cells. They derived from a different cell line, which is basically macrophages. So here's a nice little diagram that shows you the different types of cells. And let's start on this end here. Here's an osteoclast, right here, great big old thing, bunch of nuclei in it, and its job is to eat into the bone here, and that's what it's doing right here. It's eating a hole into the bone. Now, obviously, osteoclasts are very active in a patient that has weak bones. Osteoporosis, thank you. Osteomalacia and then osteoporosis, yes. Mostly women, mostly old women, but it happens in men too. There are times when I used to walk through our hospital, which we had 50 beds, and it was not unusual that 30 of the beds had little old ladies with broken hips. Okay? Broken hips is a huge, huge problem in our country. It is so expensive to take care of these folks. It's also so expensive to rehabilitate them, and it is so fatal. You realize that about 30 years ago, the fatality rate of a broken hip was 50%. Half of the people that broke their hip never got out of the hospital. 50%. Now, we've got it down to about 5% now, but the way we got it out is we take these people, and the minute that old lady hits the door in the emergency room, gets an x-ray and says she's got a broken hip, an entire team of people kind of jumps on her. A cardiologist, a respiratory guy, maybe a kidney doctor if they're old enough and have kidney troubles, and they do everything they can to get her tuned up as well as possible. Get her heart in its best shape, lungs in the best shape, and so forth, so that they can get her into the operating room no more than 12 hours later. Within 12 hours, you want that lady to be in the operating room and getting her hip replaced or fixed or pinned or whatever they're going to do to it. Because then you want her to be up and walking within another 6 hours or 8 hours. Because if you don't get her off her back and get her out of bed and get her up walking, she's a dead lady walking. She's going to die. The reason is they've got to walk, they've got to get up. It's good for their lungs, it's good for their heart. It keeps them from getting pneumonia, it keeps them from getting blood clots. Those are all the things that used to kill all those people with broken hips. So it's a huge team effort these days when somebody comes in with a broken hip. And then you get them up, you get them walking, and physical therapists are called in, and you know, it's a big deal. And it should be, because it is a disease that used to have a huge mortality, and now it has a lot less. It's why I lift weights. We know that really the only thing that makes your bones get stronger is weight resistance. That's really the only thing that makes your bones get stronger. You heard the article, there was an article came out about 2 weeks ago on the news that vitamin D doesn't really help that much. Calcium supplements don't really help that much. Weight resistance. So, you know, get out and walk, lift a little weight. Even if it's small, it's really good for the strength of your bones. So here we go. Here's the endostem. Once again, here they've got it flipped around from this picture to that picture. But here's osteoprogenitor cells that turns into the bone cell line. Here are osteoblasts along the edge of the endosteal cavity, the medullary cavity. These guys are going to start making bone. And then once they get bone made all around them, they kind of look like this. And this is an osteocyte. And osteocytes form little circles, little rings. And they have these little cytoplasmic extensions called canaliculi that connect them and allow the oxygen and so forth to diffuse from the central canals, which are not shown in this picture. Okay. So, homeostasis, I already alluded to this, is bone building by osteoblasts and bone recycling by osteoclasts. It has to be in balance. If it's not, you either get too much bone laid down, but usually you get not enough. Exercise, particularly weight-bearing exercise, causes osteoblasts to build bone. I do two things in my life to keep from getting a broken hip. At 65, I lift some weights. I do drink milk with vitamin D in it. But I also always grab the handrail going down any set of steps. Because I know, no matter how strong my bones are, if I take a tumble and fall down a set of steps, that'll be my last lecture. That'll be the last time I come out here to PCC. Because it'll probably be a very, very long and painful recovery from a broken hip. So, don't knock me down the steps, please. Unless you don't ever want to see me again. All right. So when we talk about the structure of compact bone, we talk about the osteon. Now I tried to draw you one over here, but I'm going to show you pictures that are a lot better. The osteocytes are arranged in what are called concentric lamellae. What does concentric mean? It means circular. Huh?
Same center.
Yeah, have the same center. So concentric circles would be like this. Okay? Because they have the same center. All right? So that's what makes up an osteon. The central canal is the thing that's out there in the very middle of it, right there where the blood vessels live. There are some perforating canals that go in from the side. We have wonderful models of this over in the lab, and you need to look at them. They will be on the next practical exam, I can promise you. There are also a couple of lamellae that are not concentric. They're called circumferential. They go around the entire bone. They're on the outside. So they're circumferential, go around the whole bone. And those are well illustrated on the model over there too. Here's an up close and personal one here. Here's the central canal right here. These dark things here, these dark spots are the osteocytes here, and maybe here, and maybe here, and so forth. And then all these things going this way are the canaliculi, right? Going in and out. They are nothing more than cytoplasmic extensions from the osteocytes. And so here's an osteon right here, and you see it's like 1, 2, maybe 3 layers thick. There's also some what we call interstitial lamellae. If all of your osteons are circular, like this guy here, and here's the next one, and here's the next one, there's going to be some spaces in between like that, right? And that's where the interstitial lamellae take part. They're the ones that fill in the areas right here. Here's a piece of bone that has been demineralized, and it's just really a pretty picture. Here's an osteon right here. Here's another osteon right here. The central canal is here. The vessels have been dissolved away. Here are the little lacunae that have osteocytes that live in them, and the little canaliculi go in and out. Here's a close-up picture. It's even better. This is kind of a very thin bone, but bone's thicker than this. But here's the central canals going up and down the bone. There are some perforating arteries and veins that go in and out to get the blood into these arteries and veins that go in the central canals. Notice here's concentric lamellae here and here. Here's an interstitial lamellae in there filling in. And then on the outside of the bone itself are these circumferential lamellae that go all the way around. Okay. Here's the endosteum right here at the edge of the marrow cavity, right along in there. This is spongy bone out in the middle. So the bone marrow is made up of spongy bone. Now, going back to Kentucky Fried Chicken, if you take that bone and break it, you know that in the middle there's this dark blackish blue purple stuff, which is basically bone marrow, right? Which you can suck out if you want, and it's very nutritious actually. But it's really what you're eating is a lot of this spongy bone in here, because after frying this stuff becomes pretty soft, and it's pretty soft in the middle. This stuff out here, even after frying, doesn't get that soft, so it's still going to seem like bone, but the stuff in the middle doesn't.
Did you tell us what the perforating canal is?
Perforating canal just brings the blood in from the outside. These are central canals going this way. See, because they're surrounded by osteons.
Yeah.
Perforating ones are the ones that bring it in from the outside into these different. This is important. This is one of the major reasons our bones are as strong as they are, is because of this osteon, these circumferential lamellae, not circumferential, but concentric lamellae, 1, 2, 3 right here. When the collagen is laid down in those concentric lamellae. You notice in one here, the collagen fibers go in this direction, and in the next one, the collagen fibers go in that direction, and in the next one, they go in this direction. Obviously, they do that for added strength. That makes the bones a lot stronger because there's that alternating form. Please notice that I told you that the endosteum lines the marrow cavity. Remember that the endosteum also lines the central canals. Okay, so here's a central canal, and notice that there's endosteum on the inside of it. So the inside of all of these bony areas, these bony holes, is lined with endosteum. Okay? So the structure of spongy bone, if we've been talking about compact bone or solid bone, the spongy bone doesn't really have osteons. The matrix in there forms kind of an open network that we call trabeculae. That's these little branches of spicules of bone. There are no blood vessels in here, but the whole space in the middle there is simply filled with red bone marrow. Now, it has blood vessels that dump into it in the bone marrow, and it has blood vessels that take blood out of it. But the bone marrow itself is just one big sea of blood, so to speak. As we get older, our some of our bone marrow turns from red bone marrow into yellow bone marrow. It quits making new blood, and it stores fat. Now, some of you guys I know work on ambulances, and this was not around, it was just starting to hit the scene when I retired from surgery. But if we take a cross section of somebody's leg right through their calf, so here's their calf, and your calf has a big bone up here, which is called the tibia, and the tibia is right underneath your skin. Right up here on the front part, that's your shin, you know it as. Well, that's your tibia because it's laying right under the skin. And then back over here, there's a little bone called the fibula. And then there's some great big muscles in here that fill all of this area and account for the shape of people's calves. Really, it's mostly muscles. Well, one of the big problems that we used to have a lot more than we do now is because you'd come on the scene of an accident and you had a kid or a smaller person that had been bleeding. And because it had been bleeding, it was really hard to find veins in them. Usually their blood pressure was low. You put tourniquets on, you couldn't find any veins, so you didn't have anything to stick needles into to give them blood or give them IV fluid or give them drugs, whatever. And so somebody said, well, why don't we just stick a needle right into their bone marrow? And so a set of guys, developed a technique called an interosseous infusion. And they would basically, this is bone marrow, they would just take a little drill and just drill it right into the center of the bone here, and then hook it up to so then you had a pipe going right into their bone marrow, hook it up to tubing, and you could run fluid right into their bone marrow. Done that?
Yeah, we're learning actually right now.
Huh?
We're learning it right now.
You're learning it. And basically, because of the fact that what I was just talking about over here, that the bone marrow is just all full of blood, you can just dump stuff into it, and it'll find its way out into the rest of your system. Because there are blood vessels that lead out of the bone marrow, just like there are blood vessels that lead into it. So, I think in little kids, in little babies, you don't even need a drill. Can't you just take a needle and...
Depends on all the kids.
Yeah, is there some limit, though? Do you know? I haven't learned that yet.
We still use the drill in the hospital.
Yeah.
You use it in the hospital?
We have one on the radio.
On codes or just routine?
Yeah, in emergency situations where you can't get a line.
Yeah. Most of the time, you can always get a line, get a catheter or a tube into somebody's vein. if you have time. You can obviously take it to surgery, make an incision, and go down and put a line in if you need to. But if it's an emergency, this is the new deal, and it's really saving lives. So here's the structure of spongy bone. I've already mentioned it. This is the femur here. This is the head of the femur. Notice that the sides all down the length of the bone are compact bone. They're really the hard stuff. The middle part is either bone marrow or it's real spongy bones and spongy bone like illustrated here. Remember, so this is where the metaphysis is, right along about here. So from there up, it's usually mostly spongy bone in the epiphysis. How do bones carry weight? Well, they usually carry it down the sides because that's where the strength is. This picture is really cute. I'm not sure what points I could make from it other than, your body weight is carried on your hip, on your femur, and it pushes on the head of the femur like that, and that stress is carried mostly down the medial side, but by the time it gets down to the bottom, it's kind of spread out. And then it's passed to the tibia, which is the bone in your leg down here. It's spread out across the surface of the end of the femur there. Compact bone always has a periosteum on the outside. It has, the periosteum is very tough, as I mentioned. It covers all of the bones except for the parts that are enclosed in a joint capsule. In other words, if this was your arm bone, for example, and this is the end of your arm bone, where it touches the next bone, the end of it here is going to be covered with cartilage so that they can move in the joint. Every other part, other than the part that's in the joints, is covered with periosteum. Periosteum is really tough. It's very hard. It's very hard to peel it off the bones. It's easier if the bones have been fried, like I mentioned, but in real life, it's really hard to peel the periosteum off of the bones. And the reason is because there's collagen fibers that perforate and go all the way down into the bone as well to give it more strength. What are the functions of periosteum? Well, it separates the bone from the stuff that's not in the bone. It also provides a route for the blood and the nerves to go in. And periosteum is, it also adds strength, and it participates in bone growth and repair, because that's where a lot of the new bone cells are located. So here's the point I was just making. Here's periosteum on the outside, and there's a lot of perforating fibers that don't really illustrate very well here. It says here perforating fibers. But just know that the periosteum is very, very tightly attached to the bone on the outside. And when you break a bone, it's not the broken bone that hurts, it's the tear in the periosteum. This is what hurts, because all the nerves live in the periosteum. So when you break a bone, by definition, you have torn the periosteum. That's what hurts. Endosteum I've mentioned, it's on the inside. And I think I've already said all I need to say about it. Here's an example. This is the endosteum around here. Has the osteoclasts in it, has new osteoblasts and so forth. Build a new bone. Our bones continue to grow till we're about 25. So those of you that are short right now, although you'll probably always be short, if you haven't hit 25, your bones are still growing a little bit. In America, with basketball players making millions of dollars, there are people in this town that are out there feeding their kids growth hormone to make them grow taller. If they're a 9th grader who is not very tall, but yet the parents look at him and say, gosh, I think he's got basketball talent, they're finding a way to get a hold of growth hormone to get them bigger. And that's kind of a sad statement, but yet it's true, because we know what hormones make you grow taller. And if they're wanting to make that investment, or they want their kid to make varsity or something, it's happening. Osteogenesis means making new bone. I said that before. Ossification means the process of replacing other tissues with bone. Sometimes we get bone formed where we don't really want it in other structures. We used to see it in incisions once in a while. Somebody had an incision down the midline here, and you're reoperating on them 10 years later, and it's all calcified. It's all bone you're cutting through the second time through. That's heterotopic bone formation found in places where you really don't want it. Calcification just means the process of depositing salts. Obviously, that occurs during ossification. Ossification just means how does bone form, and how does it become ossified or become tough mineral, solid salt, basically. It happens by two basic ways, and I have a video that I will show you either here or over in lab that tries to sort out the things called intramembranous ossifications and endochondral ossifications. Now, just real quick, look at those words. Intramembranous means bones that formed between two membranes. Now, we have two bones in our body that form in that way. One is the jawbone here. Starts out with a membrane and a membrane on the inside, and between those two membranes, it forms bone. The other one that forms by intramembranous ossification is the collarbone. Also begins between two layers of membrane. Most of our bone in our body is formed by endochondral ossification. What do you think endochondral means? Inside chondral cartilage. Right. Remember what I said earlier? We start out as babies and our whole skeletal structure is cartilage. It's not bone. And then it gradually becomes ossified. It turns from cartilage into bone. So this is the main way that our bodies form bone. It starts off as cartilage, turns into bone. I'm going to skip through this because I have this video to show you, and I really think you need to go through and learn this in the book as well. It's pretty laid up very nicely. It has much better pictures. Here's a hyaline cartilage. The whole bone is hyaline cartilage. It finally starts forming, it starts forming a little bone here along the sides and the diaphysis. And here you have now bone marrow, and you're getting more compact bone along the sides. And then out here at the end, another area starts forming in the middle where bone starts forming here in the epiphysis, and it gradually fills and becomes spongy bone. And then eventually this epiphyseal junction here also turns to bone by age 25, and you're all fused. I'm going to leave these for video and for us to look at in the book. Here's an example of an x-ray of a hand, and obviously this is the end of the radius. This is the end of the ulna, and this is the thumb bone. These are the metacarpals. That's the first metacarpal, second, third, fourth, fifth metacarpal. These are the carpal bones, the wrist bones. You see there's 8 of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and there's one in there behind somewhere because there are 8. This is the epiphyseal plate, we call it. This is where the epiphysis of this bone is fusing to the epiphyseal plate, which hasn't happened yet. So we know by looking at this film that this kid is below the age of 25, probably a lot younger than that, because you notice that a number of the bones are not fused yet. That one's still open, this one is still open, that one's open, and so forth. So you can use an x-ray like this to kind of determine age of somebody and whether or not their bones are fusing properly based on a chart of how many should be fused by a certain age. And here is another one where all of them are fused. So this is an older person. There's still lines in there. You can still see a line sort of where the epiphysis fused, but yet it's not open like it was on those others. The 2 dermal bones that I already mentioned that are formed by dermal ossification are the mandible and the clavicle. And basically it just starts as 2 layers of membrane, and it like I said, I want to show you that in the video, and also I want you to read about it. Whoops. Here's kind of a standard bone. This is not meant to be any one. I guess it's really the humerus if it's any. But you notice that this is pretty typical. Most of the bones will have little holes, little foramen at the top end for blood vessels to get in. And they'll have one in the middle to let blood in and let blood out. And they'll also have them down at the other end. Because remember, when these things were forming, they were really forming as three separate bones. Remember diaphysis and epiphysis. Periosteum around the bones also contains lymphatic vessels and lots of nerves, like I mentioned. This is an abnormal patient who was laying down bone all over the place. Not a very healthy situation. A patient who has heterotopic. Heterotopic means in the wrong place, bone formation. How do we remodel ourselves? I think that bone remodeling is an amazing thing. And let me just give you an example. If you break how many people in here have broken their collarbone? One? Well, you're going to select a crowd with Tony Romo, Lance Armstrong, lots of other athletes. But, you know, we would get broken collarbones into the ER, and the bone might look like this. And so this part had broken from that part. They were completely out of joint. They were completely laying on top of each other, and obviously it hurt like hell. And usually it's a kid who fell off the swings or landed on their arm or something. But this was good enough. That was good enough, because they were going to have a complete recovery and it would be perfectly normal in the end. Now, in honesty, what you would do is you'd put them in a figure-of-8 dressing, which was a kind of a fancy deal that pulls both of their shoulders back. And by pulling both of their shoulders back, it kind of pulls this apart so that hopefully it won't be that much overlap. It'll maybe only be half that much overlap. And that and it also holds it steady so it doesn't hurt them every time they move. But, you know, you'd come back in 6 weeks, and it might look like this, and then you'd come back in 6 months, and it would kind of look like this, and you'd come back in 2 years, and it would look perfectly normal. And that's called remodeling. The bones continue to remodel. The parts that don't need to be there, the osteoclasts come in and eat them up. Parts that do need to be there, they lay down more bone. So there's a lot of remodeling goes on, and I just hit the button by accident. I went through a bunch of slides that I've already talked to you about.
You're going the wrong way.
Huh?
You're going the wrong way.
No, really? No. Oh, yeah. You're right. I'm going the wrong way. I think we just have 2 or 3 slides left. I'd like to finish them if I can. So that's bone remodeling. Oh, you got a lot more. Okay. Exercise is good. Stress bones become thicker and stronger, and bone degenerates very quickly. If you take somebody and you put them in bed, say they're ill with some problem, they can lose 1/3 of their bone mass in a week. 1/3 of all their bones will dissolve away in a week if they don't ever get out of bed, if they're not moving around. And obviously a lot of people, when they're really sick, they're not. You can't get them out of bed sometimes. And that's why physical therapy, even for other diseases besides bone fractures, is so important, because even though they didn't have broken bone, their bones lost a tremendous amount of strength, and they have to build that all back. Okay? All right, we'll stop there. We will start back here next Tuesday, a week from today, because Thursday we have an exam. see you in lab in a while.